By using ADO.NET, I can able to execute the commands, or I can able to run the command. If I request any information from the database, that must provide, and that is known as in terms of transaction. What is SQL? That is nothing but structured query language statements and stored procedures. Hello to all, a warm welcome to my new session on data access with ADO.NET. I'm your Revati ma'am, faculty from the Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram, First Grade College, the Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. So dear student, before going to start my today's session, let me to recall the topic what I have discussed in my last session. So dear student, in my last session, I started with how to create Windows form, and I have explained a simple program to add two numbers using Windows form. But in my today's session, I'm going to deal with new chapter, and the chapter name here is ADO.NET. So what is this ADO.NET and what is the need of ADO.NET and where we are going to use ADO.NET? All those things we are going to study in my today's session. So here various connection architecture, and we are going to understand what is ADO.NET with its class library. Along with that, I'm going to discuss some of the important class which is supported by the ADO.NET and how to connect a database using ADO.NET. So dear student, what is meant by ADO.NET? That is nothing but ActiveX data object. So what is ADO? That is nothing but ActiveX data object. Anyway, dear student, let's start our session with the topic ADO.NET. So dear student, we know that .NET is nothing but a framework that supports ASP.NET, C#.NET, along with that ADO.NET, Visual Studio.NET. So we know that it is a framework. Under this framework, we are going to have ADO.NET. Now, what is ADO? It is nothing but the ActiveX data object. It is a set of class. So it is a set of built-in classes to interact with the data source such as databases and XML files. So dear student, till yesterday we were discussing about how to create Windows form. Now, if I consider Windows form, it's mainly used to design user interface or user application. Now, the users are able to enter the data. Once the data is entered, where we are going to store the data and why we want ADO.NET. So, dear student, if I consider application form like online application, and I'm going to fill complete student information. Now, I'm going to enter all the information, and where I'm going to store all the information at the back end. So what is back end here and how I'm going to establish the connection? For that, I'm going to have the ADO.NET. So here ADO.NET that provides set of classes. It's nothing but a framework to interact with data source. So what is data source? That's nothing but the database as well as XML file. So what is XML file here? XML, that is extensible markup language files. Then what about database? Before that, let me to discuss what is data. So what is data here? Data is nothing but the raw fact or unprocessed data, and if it is possible to store or record, then it is called data. And what is database? When I have collection of data, then it is termed as database. So here ADO.NET is mainly used to interact with the databases as well as XML files. So here ADO is nothing but ActiveX data objects. It allows us to connect to underlying data as well as database. So dear student, think that I have front end and I am going to store the data in the back end. Now, what I want to do, I just want to access the data which is stored in the back end. To establish the connection, I require ActiveX data object. It has classes, in the sense it is a built-in framework that includes classes, methods to retrieve. So it is retrieve is nothing but the access, and manipulate is nothing but modify the data. So what is ADO.NET? It provides classes to retrieve the data as well as modify the data. And why I want ADO.NET? What is the need? So dear student, by using ADO.NET, I can able to execute the commands, or I can able to run the command. So here, these are the following .NET application that uses ADO. So here, ADO.NET is to connect to a database. So once it is connected to the database, then what's the next process? To execute commands and to retrieve the data from the databases. And what are the applications I can have here? That is ASP.NET web application. So what is this ASP.NET? There's nothing but the active server page. Along with that, I can have console application as well as I can have Windows application. Now, I'm going to have the architecture. So there are two types of architecture, that is connected architecture as well as disconnected architecture. Let's see what is connected architecture. In the connected architecture, the application remains connected with the database throughout the processing. So here, think that I have online application, in the sense I want to fill online form. Now, each time this application must connected with the database, because we have n number of users and we don't know when they are going to fill the form. In that situation, what I want to do, I want to use connected architecture, in the sense the application remains connected with the database throughout the processing. Now, disconnected architecture. So, the application automatically connects and disconnects during the processing. So, dear student, as the name itself suggests that the architecture is going to connect, in the sense the application is going to connect it to the database and disconnected to the database automatically and based on the requirement. The application uses temporary database on the application side is called data set. So dear student, if any application that uses temporary data, then it is known as data set. So there are two types of architecture, connected and disconnected architecture. So I'm going to have the understanding ADO.NET and its class library. See here, these are my .NET application. I can able to develop web application, Windows application, console application and any other applications like class library, so on. Now see here, I'm going to have the ActiveX data objects .NET. So these are the component. Okay, along with that, I'm going to have the data set. And under ActiveX data object, I'm going to have system.data.sql client. So dear student, as we know that this .NET is nothing but the product of Microsoft and we are going to use SQL. Okay, so we are going to use SQL. So I'm going to have the SQL client. Even I can have the Oracle client. I'm going to have the object linking embedded database. So OLEDB and ODBC. Okay, along with that, what are the connections I can have here? Connection, commands, data reader, data adapter as well as data set. So these are the component of ADO.NET. Anyway, we are going to study what is connection, what is command, what is data reader and what is data adapter, data set in my today's session. Now, if I consider databases, see here, I can have SQL server. I can have any database. Okay, so here I can have SQL server, Oracle, OLEDB, ODBC. Then I can have other data sources. Now, dear student, let me to consider the important classes in ADO.NET. See here, what are the classes I can have? That is connection class, command class, data reader class, data adapter class as well as data set class. Anyway, we are going to study all these topics one by one in my today's session. Okay, fine. See here. Connection class. So what is connection class? See here, in ADO.NET we use this connection class to connect to the database. So dear student, as the name itself indicates that suppose if I want to connect to any databases, then I must use connection class in my application. For example, I will take online application form itself. Okay, when I fill the data, this application must be connected to the back end. There is nothing but the database. Okay, to establish the connection, I'm going to have connection class. This connection class also manage transaction and connection pooling. So what is transaction? It is not money transaction. So what is transaction? That's nothing but the execution of all the queries and responses. In the sense, okay, if I request any information from the database, that must provide, and that is known as in terms of transaction. Okay, anyway, this connection class also manage transaction and it is responsible for connection pooling. Then I'm going to have command class. So what is command class? As the name itself indicates that it's going to provide some commands to the user. For example, suppose if the user want to insert any data, then what I want to do? I want to use command class. If I want to retrieve the data, once again, I want to use command class. If I want to modify the data, once again, I'm going to use command class. So, the command class provides methods for storing and executing SQL. So what is SQL? That is nothing but structured query language statements and stored procedures. The following are the various commands used by the command class in that execute reader. So it returns data to the client as row. In the sense, when I execute reader, what is the output? I'm going to get the data. Okay, and that is in the form of rows. This would typically be an SQL selection statement or a stored procedure that contains one or more select statement. For example, think that I have a table called student. Okay, fine. Now, I just want to display the content which is present in this table. So, what I will do in my SQL programming language, I'll write select star from student. So, what is the output? I'm going to get all the rows as well as column which is present in the table student. And when I call execute reader, it returns the data to the client. Now, execute non-query. So, executes a command that changes the data in the database. Okay, so I'm going to have another command that is execute non-query. There are certain times if I want to modify the statement or if I want to modify the field in the table, then I'm going to use update or delete or insert statement. Okay, fine. So, by using execute non-query, I'm going to change the database. Think that I just created the table. Now I want to insert the content. For that, I'm going to have insert command. Once the insertion is done, now I just want to modify the content. To modify the content, I'm going to have the update command. And I want to delete some rows from the table. For that, I'm going to have the delete command. Okay. Now, execute scalar. This method only returns a single value. So, dear student, when I want to get only one single value, then I'm going to use execute scalar. And it is responsible for returning only one value. And this kind of query returns a count of rows or calculated value. In the sense, if I want to get the total number of count, then I can able to use execute scalar. Then I'm going to have execute XML reader. If I consider SQL client class, it's used to obtain data from an SQL server 2000 database. Okay, suppose if I want to access any information which is stored in the SQL server 2000, then I'm going to use execute XML reader. So, here XML is a stream used to read the content and it returns an XML reader object. Now, I'm going to have reader class, that is data reader class. As the name itself indicates that it's mainly used to read or retrieve the information. Okay, to retrieve the data, I'm going to have data reader. It is used in conjunction with the command class to execute an SQL select statement and then access the returned rows. So, dear student, when I use data reader class with the SQL selection statement, then it returns the conjunction with the command class. Okay, and it's also mainly used to retrieve the data which is stored in the database. Now I'm going to have data adapter class. So dear student, here the data adapter is used to connect data set to databases. So dear student, if I want to connect my data set to the databases, then I'm going to use data adapter. So a data adapter is most useful when using data bound control in Windows form. When I'm going to use data adapter, when I'm going to create Windows form and I want to bound the data, in that time I'm going to use data adapter. But it can also be used to provide easy way to manage and the connection between your application as well as underlying database. In the sense, it's also used to establish connection between the application as well as the database. And whatever the database you want, you can select. But to establish the connection between database and application, I'm going to use data adapter class. And it also provides views as well as stored procedure. So dear student, till now we discussed what is ADO.NET, what's the use, how we can able to use. Okay, fine. Now I'm going to discuss how to connect to a database using ADO.NET. In the sense, how I'm going to establish a connection between application and database and what are the steps I need to follow. So here, to create a connection, you must be familiar with connection strings. So here, a connection string is nothing but required as a parameter to SQL connection. So dear student, think that I have a application, that's nothing but the form. Okay, now I have database connection. Now I want to establish connection between my application as well as database. Okay, for that, first what I required connection string. So what is connection string? It is a parameter. So what is connection string? It is a parameter to SQL connection. A connection string is a string variable. So what is connection string? It is a string variable used to connect or used to establish SQL connection. And this contains key and value pairs. So dear student, when I consider connection string, it includes two fields. One is key and value, like provider name or the server name or the database name or the user ID and word as in the following. So this is the example. See here. For example, if I have server, then I have to specify the name of the server or the IP address of the server. For example, once again, if I have database, then I have to specify the name of the database. And if I consider user ID, then I have to specify the username who has permission to work with database. And if I consider word, the word of user ID. Now, let me to consider the example here. String. Okay, it is const and it's of type string. So here, server. It is database. Then institute. User ID is nothing but Rakesh and word is nothing but ABC@123. So dear student, this is the way I can able to connect to a database by using ActiveXDataObject.net. Anyway, dear student, in my today's class, I started with what is ADO.net and what are the uses of ADO.net along with some applications of ADO.net. Anyway, dear student, in my next session, I'm going to deal with question paper. Okay, in the sense, I'm going to discuss some question paper. Dear student, let's meet in the next session with the question paper. Until that, keep watching and keep learning. Thank you.